Before he and his wife Martha had children, he used to travel the country giving a seminar. The title of the seminar was The 10 Commandments for Raising Perfect Children. That was before he had children of his own. After he and Martha had their first child, he renamed the seminar. He called it 10 Hints for Parents. And after their second child, he renamed the seminar again. He called it A Few Tentative Suggestions from a Fellow Struggler. Well, Steve asked me today to come and talk about witnessing with boldness, unhindered. And I do so as a fellow struggler. I don't have these issues perfected in my own life. I resonate with what Paul said in Philippians chapter 3, verse 12. Not that I've already obtained it or have already become perfect, but I press on.
Amen.
To lay hold of that for which Christ Jesus has also laid hold of me. In addition to seeking to be a faithful witness myself, I also teach evangelism to others. So I've given a lot of thought to what hinders us in our evangelistic effectiveness. I think there are many things that we could discuss today, but let me highlight 5 of them for us in this session. What hinders our witness? I would suggest first it's a lack of compassion. A lack of compassion. In Matthew 9:36, we read, when Jesus saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus didn't just see the multitudes, he felt compassion for them. Do we have that compassion for the lost? The Apostle Paul certainly had that compassion. In Romans chapter 9, he says, I have great sorrow and unceasing grief in my heart. I could wish that I myself were accursed, separated from Christ for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh. Do you get what Paul is saying there? He said, my fellow Jews, those that have tried to kill me on multiple occasions, I have such a burden for their salvation. If it were possible to trade my salvation for theirs, I would do it. Well, of course, our Lord had this burden for the lost. In Luke 19:41, it said, when he approached the city of Jerusalem, he wept over it. And in Matthew 9, when he saw the multitudes, he felt compassion. What do you feel when you see the sinful multitudes? See, I fear that one of the byproducts of the so-called cultural war of our day is that we have begun to view unbelievers as the enemy. Unbelievers are not the enemy. They are victims of our true enemy. Right. Satan has blinded their eyes. He holds them captive to do his will. Our true enemy is Satan, not lost people. I need to be reminded of this story, or of this principle, far too often. When our youngest daughter, Carissa, turned 17, one of her birthday presents, she wanted to get her ears pierced, and I agreed to take her to get that done. I was going to take her to the mall, to Claire's, to get her ears pierced like her 2 big sisters, but Carissa wanted to go to Bardstown Road. If you've been in Louisville on Bardstown Road, that's where they have tattoo parlors, piercing stations, and I agreed to take her. It was a cultural experience. I'd never been inside this tattoo parlor. I'd actually done some street preaching on the corner right outside of it, but never been inside. There were multiple tattoo stations, and there were 3 piercing stations, but only one was occupied that day. One of the piercers was sick, the other one was gone. So there was a long line. We were told it was going to be over an hour wait. I'm begging with my daughter, let's go to the mall, get this done. I will take you anywhere you want to go eat. Ruth Chris Steakhouse, anything. She said, no, Dad, I really want to get it done here. It's kind of a badge of honor to get your ears pierced at this location. So while we're waiting, I see a woman come up in the line behind us. Now, the best way I could describe this woman, imagine a woman running at breakneck speed through Lowe's department store, falling face first into a bucket of nails. That was this woman. She had piercing in places I didn't know you could pierce. Now, not simply her ears, her nose, her lips, her tongue, but even under her cheek, throughout her eyebrows. My first reaction was one of amazement. She must have incredibly strong neck muscles. How does she even hold her head up with all that weight? And then I began to wonder, I wonder if this woman ever travels, going through airport security. She'd have to get there 3 hours ahead of time to take all this metal off, put it in the tray, and then to reassemble it on the other side. But then my heart turned to criticism. And as I looked on this woman, I began to think, well, what's wrong with her? Why does she do this to herself? My critical thoughts were interrupted by my daughter's voice. My daughter turned to this woman and said, looks like a long wait today. And the woman said, yeah, they said it'd be a little over an hour, but, that happens. My daughter said, well, since we're waiting here, would you like to talk? The woman said, sure, what do you want to talk about? My daughter said, why don't we talk about God? This woman looked at my daughter and said, sweetheart, what would God want with someone like me? My daughter said, that's a great question. We've got an hour to discuss it. Let me tell you. Now, at that moment, I had dueling banjos playing in my heart. But part of my heart is so thrilled that my 17-year-old daughter, who's not even old enough to get her ears pierced without parental permission, has compassion on this woman and is seeking to share Christ with her. But the other part of my heart is so disgusted with myself. When am I going to learn this lesson? When am I going to become more like my Lord, that when I see sinners, I don't look on them with criticism or condemnation, but with compassion? There's a poem that challenges us to have a heart of compassion. It says, for God so loved the world, not just a few, not just the wise and great or the noble and true, or those of favored class or high rank or certain hue. God loved the world. Do you? There's a second thing that hinders our evangelistic effectiveness, and that is love of comfort. Love of comfort. My guess is that if a resolution were brought here to Indiana Baptist condemning the so-called prosperity gospel movement, that it would pass unanimously. This hall would be filled with amens supporting that resolution. We understand that God has not promised us a life free from suffering and sickness. And yet I wonder if perhaps living here in America, we've imbibed a little bit of the spirit of the so-called prosperity gospel. We don't want to have to sacrifice. We don't want to have to suffer. We love our comfort. Yeah. Listen to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 12. He says, we endure everything so that we will in no way hinder the gospel of Christ. Yes. Do you get what Paul's saying there? Paul said, I will put up with anything. I will endure anything in my life so that the gospel of Christ would not be hindered. I'm not going to say anything or do anything that might hinder the gospel of Christ. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul issues a challenge for us. It's a challenge to surrender our so-called rights for the sake of the gospel. Amen. You know what I fear we do all too often? We hold on to our rights in surrender, sharing the gospel, because we love comfort. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19, Paul says, though I'm free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. Paul was free. He was a Roman citizen. What does Paul choose to do with his freedom? Well, he tells us, I make myself a slave to everyone. Why, Paul? Well, why would you choose to live that way? Well, he tells us, so that I might win as many as possible. He further goes on in verse 23, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 23. I do all things for the sake of the gospel. You know, as I was reading through that verse this past week, it cut me to the quick. Can I say that honestly about my life, that I do all things for the sake of the gospel? At times, I can't say that. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 15, as Paul continues his correspondence with this church that he planted, with his church that he loves, he says, I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. As we reflect on that, we have to ask ourselves the question, where is our spirit of sacrifice? Where is it that we are willing to spend and be spent for the souls of others? Do we prize our comfort so much that we want to just live in our comfort zone? We want to just dwell there and not risk going outside of it because that means sacrifice? Isaac Watts, in his hymn, Am I a Soldier of the Cross, asks us some penetrating questions. Am I a soldier of the cross, a follower of the Lamb? And shall I fear to own his cause, or blush to speak his name? Must I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas? Are there no foes for me to face? Must I not stem the flood? Is this vile world a friend to grace, to help me on to God? No, I must fight if I would reign. Increase my courage, Lord. I'll bear the toil, endure the pain, supported by thy word. There's a third thing that hinders our evangelistic effectiveness, and that is a lessened love for Christ. A lessened love for Christ. Notice I did not say a lack of love for Christ, because we do love Christ. But I wonder if we love him as we did in the beginning. I wonder if we have that passionate, unbridled, passionate love for Christ that we did as a brand new believer. Could it be said of us, as Jesus said of the church at Ephesus, I have this against you. You have lost the love that you had at first. John Stott, in his book, Our Guilty Silence, says, is this not the cause of our guilty silence? We do not speak for Christ because we do not so love his name that we cannot bear to see him unacknowledged and unadored. Or as John Piper says, where there is little passion for the king, there will be little passion for the kingdom. Are we willing to be seen as fools for Christ's sake? Do you know what D.L. Moody's nickname was in Chicago? He was called Crazy Moody. You know why he was called Crazy Moody? Because he witnessed to every single person he came into contact with, without exception. He sought to share Christ with them, and so people call him crazy. And yet D.L. Moody was the most sane man in Chicago because he believed the Word of God. He believed the gospel. Do we love our comfort so much that we fear being labeled a fanatic? Richard Baxter, the great 17th century Puritan pastor, noted that if he's walking down the street and he sees somebody's house on fire, and he yells out, "Fire! Fire!" He said, "They call me a hero." But he said, when I see somebody's spiritual house on fire, and I yell out, "Fire, fire!" He said, "They call me a fanatic." He said, "You know what? They're right. I am a fanatic. Because if people do not repent, they will perish." I love being around new believers, don't you? You just cannot shut them up. Well, we have a new believer in our church in Louisville, Denise. Denise has had a tough life. 50 years old, but she met Jesus a few months ago, and you cannot shut her up. She's not learned how to behave. All she wants to do is talk about Jesus. All she wants to do is celebrate him and praise him. You know, Dr. Howard Hendricks has said the worst thing that can happen to a new believer is to meet an old believer. Ouch. Ouch. Shame on us. Shame on us who have known the Lord for years. Some of us for decades. And yet, we don't have that same zeal and passion that we once did. Heard the story of a young boy came home from Sunday school. There was a new teacher. His mother asked him, "Well, what was your new teacher's name?" And he said, I can't remember her name, but she must have been Jesus' grandmother because that's all she talked about." Would that would be said about us.
Amen.
I hope you get the occasion to spend some time with persecuted believers. I've had that privilege in many countries around the world. And it's so challenging. It's so humbling. What they have suffered, what they've gone through because of their love for Christ. When I was doing my master's work down at Southwestern Seminary, I worked with International Evangelism Association. And because our office was right on I-35, right on the highway, we would have a lot of people walk in off the street, sometimes looking for food, sometimes for spiritual counsel. And whenever someone would come in off the street, the president directed the receptionist to send them to me. Well, at first I thought, well, it's because he knows that I'll give good spiritual counsel. I'm, sensitive. And I realized later it's because they had no idea who these people were coming in. And if something happened to a staff member, we wanted to sacrifice our least valuable guy. We didn't want one of our experienced staff members getting hurt if someone had ill intentions. So one day the receptionist buzzes me and says, "Come out here, there's a man who wants to talk to someone." And it's a man with a very thick European accent. His name was John. So we came back to my office and I said, "John, what's up? How can I help you?" And he said, "Well, I've just moved to Fort Worth and I need a mentor." I said, "Well, that's great." I said, we believe in mentoring here. I said, "Tell me your story." John was from Romania. His father was a Baptist pastor who was murdered by the secret police under the communist dictator Ceausescu. John had picked up in his father's pulpit as a college student and had continued preaching the gospel. He likewise was threatened and finally was arrested, taken to prison and beaten for 15 days, trying to get him to recant Christ, trying to get him to deny Christ. And every time they would finish the beating, they would say, "What do you have to say now?" And John said, "I would spit the blood out of my mouth, and I would look at them and I would say, I still love you. And Jesus still loves you. And if you will repent and come to him, he will forgive you of your sins." As John was sharing this story, I asked him, I said, "John, what was your greatest fear in those 15 days in prison?" He'd already mentioned that he had a young wife and 3 children aged 5 and under. I'm trying to put myself in his shoes. I would have been terrified for my family. And so I asked him what I thought was an obvious question. What was your greatest fear? Knowing that he would say, well, concern for my family. You know what John told me? He said, my greatest fear because they kicked me often in the head was that I would lose my thinking ability. I would lose my mind and no longer be able to share the gospel with them. I said, John, about this mentoring thing, how about we be prayer partners? And for the next 4 years, I had the privilege of every week getting on my knees and praying with this beloved brother who bore the marks in his body of love for his Savior. Oscar Thompson noted, he said, when I'm walking in submission to my Lord, I bump into more people by accident who need Christ than I could ever run down on purpose. I wonder perhaps this morning if we need to rekindle our passion of love for Christ. There's a fourth thing that hinders our evangelistic effectiveness, and that is methodological confusion. Methodological confusion. We live in a day where we have an embarrassment of riches in terms of evangelistic methods, in terms of evangelistic tools. In fact, we've got so many of them, we can begin to look at all of them and get caught up in the paralysis of analysis. Well, we can start looking around trying to figure out which is the best method to use and end up using none of them. D.L. Moody was approached by a woman on one occasion who was critical of his evangelism. She said, Mr. Moody, I don't like the way you do evangelism. D.L. Moody said, well, you know, ma'am, there are days I'm not overly fond of my method myself. What approach do you use? She said, oh, well, I don't have a method. Moody said, I like my method a whole lot better than I like yours.
Right. Amen.
Reflect on the different occasions in which Jesus healed a blind man. 3 different instances and 3 different methods. On one occasion, he simply spoke the word, and the blind man could see. On another occasion, he touched the blind man's eyes, and he could see. And then, still on another occasion, he took mud and placed it in the man's eyes, and the man was able to see. Someone has imagined those 3 blind men meeting up a year later. That they're discussing how wonderful Jesus is and his healing powers. And the first man says, you know, isn't it wonderful that Jesus heals by touching? He started singing, he touched me, and he was cut off by the second man who said, boy, do you have bad theology. Jesus doesn't heal by touching. All he has to do is speak. He has to speak the word. He didn't even have to be in the same room as you are. Man, you got bad theology. And the third man interrupted them both and said, what is this, a meeting of heretics? Jesus doesn't heal by touching. He didn't heal by speaking. He uses mud. Do you know he uses mud? And those 3 men got into an argument and went their 3 separate ways, founded 3 new denominations, the Touchites, the Speakites, and the Muddites.
Yeah.
I tell people, if you don't like a particular method of witnessing, don't use it. But don't spend all your time and energy criticizing it.
Yeah.
Spend your time and energy using the method that God
Amen.
has called you to use.
Amen.
To reach out to others with the love of Christ. One of my favorite verses from the Old Testament is found in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 4. If you read Ecclesiastes 11:4, it will say something like this. He who watches the clouds will not sow. He who watches the wind will not reap. You know, I grew up on a farm in Kansas. I get that. If you go out and it looks like it's going to rain, you don't plant the crop. If it looks like it's going to be a real windy day, you don't get in the harvest field. I love the way that Ken Taylor paraphrased that verse in the Living Bible. Not a translation, a paraphrase, but he's captured the heart of Ecclesiastes 11:4. Ecclesiastes 11:4 in the Living Bible says, if you wait until conditions are perfect, you'll never get anything done. Isn't that so true? But that's true about methods as well. If we wait for the perfect method of evangelism, we will never share. Pick a method. Pick multiple methods. When I teach evangelism at Southern Seminary, I compare methods to tools in a toolbox.
Amen.
Growing up on a farm, I began receiving tools for birthday and Christmas, well, on my first birthday. I have a tool collection that would be the envy of many mechanics. Multiple toolboxes filled with tools. Some of them are specialty tools. Some I've only used one time. But I have it if the occasion provides itself. I think of methods as like tools. I want as many of them in my toolbox as I can. And when the occasion calls for it, I may share my personal testimony. Or I may give someone a gospel booklet. Or I may use the 3 circles. Or I may share the bridge illustration with them. Or I may share the Roman road. Don't spend all your time and energy criticizing methods you don't like. Pick one, pick several, and use them. There's a 5th thing that hinders our evangelistic effectiveness, and that is a loss of confidence. A loss of confidence. A loss of confidence in the gospel. In Romans 1:16, Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. For it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Amen. Now we can read that and say, well, where did Paul get such confidence in the gospel? How did Paul know that the gospel was the power of God to everyone who believed? Well, he'd experienced it himself. As we read through the pages of the book of Acts, as we come to Acts chapter 7, would we say that Saul was a likely candidate to become a Christian? No. We might say he's one of the least likely. This was a man who was there at the stoning of Stephen, giving his approval. We see him on the road to Damascus, on his way to persecute and harass Christians. But God stops him in his tracks. And Saul the persecutor becomes Paul the apostle. Paul understood the power of the gospel. I think from church history of men like John Newton. John Newton, a slave trader in England, a drunkard and alcoholic, by his own admission, the most wicked man of his generation. Who would imagine that this slave trader, drunkard, would become a pastor, a hymn writer, who wrote the hymn we love to sing, Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I found. I was blind, but now I see. Amazing grace. Some of you may know that in some Christian circles, there's been an attempt to rewrite some of our hymnody. Take out some of the offensive words and phrases. And even that hymn, Amazing Grace, has not been left unscathed. Some of the revisionists say, let's take out that word wretch. It's going to hurt people's self-esteem. How about that save a soul like me, or that save such a wonderful person like me? I think if John Newton could speak into that discussion, he would say, if you want to write your own hymn, be my guest, but leave mine alone. The whole reason it's Amazing Grace is that it reached people like me, a wretch. I think in our own day of Chuck Colson, the so-called hatchet man of the Nixon administration, right-hand man to the president's seat of power, a man who seemingly had everything except the one thing most needful, a relationship with Christ. But through Watergate, through him going to prison, Chuck Colson met Jesus Christ and spent the remaining years of his life founding prison fellowship, seeking to bring the gospel behind prison walls, and speaking on the radio, writing to reach intellectuals with the gospel. Who would imagine Chuck Colson, hatchet man, becoming Chuck Colson, Christian communicator? Let me ask you a question this morning. Do you have someone in your life that you've given up on like Saul? Someone who is religious but lost? Or maybe someone like John Newton, whose lifestyle is so far away from God, you say that person would never be interested. Or someone like Chuck Colson, who seemingly has it all, but who doesn't have the most needful thing. My undergraduate studies were in engineering at Kansas State University. We had on our faculty there Dr. Dudley Williams, one of the top nuclear physicists in the country. One day in class, as professors sometimes do, Dr. Williams chased a rabbit, told a story. He was one of the handful of scientists picked by the government to be at the first nuclear atomic test in the desert sands of New Mexico. His job was to monitor two gauges. They had carefully constructed vacuum gauges, and they were going to try and measure the magnitude of the blast when the atom was split. He was in a command shack miles away, thick cable stretching from ground zero to this command shack. He said when the bomb was detonated, an interesting thing happened. Both of those gauges he was monitoring were pegged to their maximum reading. And he said they hovered there for a while before falling back to zero. And he laughed as he told our class, do you realize the top scientific minds in the world completely underestimated the power of the atom? And as I've reflected on that story, I've thought, I think that may be what we sometimes do with the gospel. We construct a gospel gauge. We figure out how powerful we think the gospel is. And we bring that gauge up and we put it in front of someone and say, I think the gospel might be powerful enough to reach them. I'm going to share it. And then we bring it to someone else and say, oh, that doesn't look good. I know the gospel's powerful and all, but just look at this person. No, I'm not going to share with them. Could I give you a principle that the Lord's been working into my life for several years? It's the principle of never saying no for someone else. I've done that far too often in my life. Never say no for someone else. You say, how do we do that? We do that when we have an opportunity to share the gospel with someone, but we shrink back because we assume they're not going to be interested. Or we assume they're going to reject the gospel. We are saying no for them. Let's stop doing that. If they say no to Christ, that's one thing, but let's stop saying no for them. Think about the parable of the sower in Mark chapter 4. It says the sower went out to sow, and then Jesus says as he sowed, it fell on different types of soil. We all know that parable, and there's always a lot of discussion, well, what's the meaning of the thorny soil? What's the meaning of the shallow soil? But I think sometimes we miss the main point of Jesus' parable. And that is that the sower went out to sow. Here's what we have a tendency to do. We have a tendency to become soil inspectors instead of sowers. It does not say the sower went out to sow. And he first inspected the soil, and where he thought it was good soil, he sowed generously. But where he assumed it was bad soil, he withheld the seed. Let's stop being soil inspectors. Let's sow the gospel. Are we looking for the lost in Indiana? Dr. James Merritt was once asked, is there anything worse than being lost? And he quickly replied, yes, there is. You know what is worse than being lost? Is being lost and having no one looking for you. That is far worse than being lost. Charles Haddon Spurgeon said, if sinners be damned, at least let them leap to hell over our bodies. If they will perish, let them perish with our arms about their knees. Let no one go to hell unwarned and unprayed for. In theology, we talk about our sanctification being progressive. That's the operative word, progressive sanctification. And that is true. Because particularly those of us that have been believers for some time have to relearn lessons that we should have learned a long time ago. We continually have to come back to foundational principles that should already be a part of our life. So as we conclude today, let me just review these 5 hindrances, and would you, as I'm doing before the Lord, say, Lord, if this is true in my life, would you bring a fresh work of grace? If you're being hindered by a lack of compassion, ask Jesus to fill you with his compassion for the lost. By a love of comfort, say, Lord, I want to get out of my comfort zone. I want to know what it is to sacrifice for you. I want to know what it is to suffer for the gospel. A lessened love for Christ. Remember how it was when you first met Christ? I do. And I'm embarrassed that there are days that my passion for Christ today pales in comparison to what I had as a new believer. Brothers and sisters, these things should not be so. And methodological confusion. Put some methods in your toolbox and have them at hand, ready, when God provides the opportunity. And then a loss of confidence. If you've been carrying around a gospel gauge, smash it. If you've been thinking your mission was to be a soil inspector, say, God, help me instead to be a sower. I want to close with a challenge to your life and mine from the words of Sam Shoemaker. Billy Graham preached Sam Shoemaker's funeral. He was an evangelist in a previous generation. And at his funeral, Billy Graham said of Sam Shoemaker, "This man has touched more lives than any other man I've ever known." 2 months before he died, Sam Shoemaker was asked, what have you lived for? What's your life been all about? And he wrote an essay. It was called An Apology for My Life. This is what my life has been all about. And he entitled it, I Stand by the Door. He wrote, I stand by the door. I neither go too far in nor stay too far out. The door is the most important door in the world. It is the door through which people walk when they find God. And many creep along the wall like blind men with outstretched, groping hands, feeling for a door, knowing there must be a door, yet they never find it. So I stand by the door. The most tremendous thing in the world is for men to find that door, the door to God. Men die outside that door, as starving beggars die on cold nights in cruel cities in the dead of winter. They live on the other side of it because they have not yet found it. And nothing matters more compared to helping them find it and open it and walk in and find Him. So I stand by the door. Oh, I admire the people who go way in. But I wish they would not forget how it was before they got in. You see, you can go in too deeply and stay in too long and forget the people outside the door. But as for me, I shall take my old accustomed place, near enough to God to hear Him and know that He is there, but not so far from people as not to hear them and know that they are there too. Where? Outside the door. Thousands of them, millions of them, but more importantly for me, one of them, 2 of them, 10 of them, whose hands I am intended to put on the latch. So I shall stand by the door and wait for those who seek Him. I would rather be a doorkeeper. So I stand by the door. Let's share the gospel with boldness, unhindered.
Rain washing my eyes to see Your Majesty, to be still and know that You're at a loss for words, and I